every 2 years prior to an election, issue their instructions for how people ought to vote. They endorse particular candidates the way, say, an activist group would. Now, the Washington Post, after Bezos bought the paper, did endorse, in 2016, they endorsed the election of Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump. They then endorsed, in 2020, Joe Biden over Donald Trump. And so the expectation was that they would endorse Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. And yet Bezos intervened and said he thought it inappropriate. Why are we, as a newspaper, endorsing a candidate or telling people how to vote? We should give them all the information we believe was accurate about everyone running and then leave it up to the voters to make up their own mind. I have to admit that I have never really understood why it is that journalistic outlets, or ones that claim to be involved in a principally journalistic function, every 2 years prior to an election, issue their instructions for how people ought to vote. They endorse particular candidates the way, say, an activist group would or a donor group would. And by doing so, in my view, they attach themselves to that politician so that if that person wins, there's some sort of subconscious, at least, desire to see them succeed, because you are the one who encouraged people to go and vote for them. You've kind of placed yourself on their side. And I think placing yourself on the side of a politician so explicitly, so blatantly, is at the very least unjournalistic. It has no journalistic function to me. And one could even argue that it's anti-journalistic, that it really is a contradiction of what is supposed to be the journalistic function, which is holding all powerful parties account, regardless of which side they are or who they are. But it has become commonplace and expectation that major media outlets, especially the nation's largest newspapers, as well as local newspapers, especially before a presidential election, endorse the candidate that they want to see win the national election. And for papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times, it's basically automatic that they endorse the candidate who is representing the Democratic Party. You have to go back many, many years for you to find the Washington Post endorsing a Republican candidate. Since at least 2004, it's been John Kerry, Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Joe Biden. And there was obviously an expectation that the Washington Post, like the New York Times has already done, would come out and announce that it was imperative that the nation elect Kamala Harris and reject Donald Trump. And yet that's not what the Washington Post has decided to do. Apparently, the top editors of the Washington Post were all ready to do what exactly was expected of them. They actually drafted an endorsement of Kamala Harris that they were preparing to publish within the next few days. And by all reports, the owner of the Washington Post, the person who bought it for $250 million more than a decade ago, back in 2013, Amazon co-founder and multi-billionaire Jeff Bezos, overrode that decision and decided that the newspaper should not issue endorsements, not just this year, but for all future elections. Now, the Washington Post, after Bezos bought the paper, did endorse, in 2016, they endorsed the election of Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump. They then endorsed, in 2020, Joe Biden over Donald Trump. And so the expectation was that they would endorse Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. And yet Bezos intervened and said he thought it inappropriate for newspapers that are expected to be trustworthy to all sides of the political spectrum to continuously announce that they were supporting the Democratic Party candidate. Here from the Washington Post today is the leadership of the Post, namely a note from the publisher who runs the paper for Jeff Bezos, announcing why it is that they have made this decision. A note from the publisher. Quote, "The Washington Post will not be making an endorsement of a presidential candidate in this election, nor in any future presidential election. We are returning to our roots of not endorsing presidential candidates. As our editorial board wrote in 1960, the election where John Kennedy was running against Richard Nixon, and obviously coastal elites were petrified of a Nixon presidency, very much wanted JFK to win. And when the Washington Post refused to endorse in that race, as they had previously done, this is what they explained. Quote, "The Washington Post has not, quote, endorsed either candidate in the presidential campaign. That is in our tradition and accords with our action in 5 of the last 6 elections. The unusual circumstances of the 1952 election led us to make an exception when we endorsed General Eisenhower prior to the nominating conventions and reiterated our endorsement during the campaign. In light of the hindsight, we retained the view that the arguments for his nomination and election were compelling. But hindsight has also convinced us that it might have been wiser for an independent newspaper in the nation's capital to have avoided formal endorsement. We recognize that this will be read in a range of views, including as a tacit endorsement of one candidate, or as a condemnation of another, or as an abdication of our responsibility. This is inevitable, but we don't see it that way. Our job at the Washington Post is to provide through the newsroom nonpartisan news for all Americans and thought-provoking reported views from our opinion team to help our readers make up their own minds. Most of all, our job as a newspaper of the capital city of the most important country in the world is to be independent, and that is what we are and will be. Now, there's obviously a hugely disingenuous component to the Washington Post decision, which is everybody knows exactly what the Washington Post wants to happen in the 2024 election. Everyone knows that the Washington Post wants Kamala Harris to win and Donald Trump to lose. It's reflected in everything they say and do. I don't think they have a single pro-Trump op-ed columnist on their staff, just as the New York Times does not. I believe every op-ed writer on that staff, maybe with the exception of one at the Post, Mark Thiessen, none at the New York Times, are supporters of Kamala Harris, or at least are neutral. But there's almost no pro-Trump representation in this because obviously the Washington Post, being a newspaper composed of coastal liberals from the same set of 9 or 10 elite colleges in a culture of American liberalism, catering to American liberals, wants the Democratic Party to win. That's why they've endorsed the Democratic candidate for the last 25 years. So this idea that, oh, we're independent and we don't want to choose sides is, I suppose, valid for as long as it goes, which is not very far. But nonetheless, I think it's a very valid and probably superior view to say that why are we as a newspaper endorsing a candidate or telling people how to vote? We should give them all the information we believe is accurate about everyone running and then leave it up to the voters to make up their own minds. I think that's a very valid perspective, even if their biases are obvious. The Washington Post itself published a news story about what was going on inside the Washington Post from today. And the headline was, the Washington Post says it will not endorse a candidate for president. Quote, publisher William Lewis explained the decision as a return to the newspaper's roots. Quote, an endorsement of Harris had been drafted by Post editorial page staffers, but had yet to be published, according to 2 sources briefed on the sequence of events who spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to speak publicly. The decision to no longer publish presidential announcements was made by the Post owner, Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. Quote, this was a Washington Post decision to not endorse, and I would refer you to the publisher's statement in full, said the Chief Communication Officer, Kathy Baird. Now, to say this did not go over well with pretty much every single person in the liberal sector of the corporate media, which is almost all of them, and liberal operatives and Democratic Party officials in Washington, is to wildly understate the case. Marty Barron was the longtime Washington Post editor, and prior to that, he led the Boston Globe, including in its Pulitzer-winning investigation into the cover-up of molestation inside the Catholic Church, which became the subject of an award-winning film called Spotlight. And he then went to the Washington Post, where he ran the Post for many years, and he was indignant over what he saw as an abdication of the journalistic responsibility to tell voters how to vote. Here from the Boston Globe, the headline, former Washington Post editor Marty Barron slams newspaper for not making presidential endorsement. Quote, this is cowardice. With democracy as its casualty, Barron, also the former editor of the Boston Globe, wrote on X, quote, real Donald Trump will see this as an invitation to further intimidate Jeff Bezos and others, disturbing spinelessness at an institution famed for courage. Now, there's so many things to dissect there about that self-serving, self-glorifying depiction that he offers of himself and the Washington Post and the U.S. corporate media in general as being so brave. What kind of bravery would be required for the Washington Post to do what it always does every 4 years, which is endorse the Democratic president? And the idea that somehow Donald Trump has intimidated Jeff Bezos, on whom the U.S. security state relies through Amazon for a whole variety of crucial contracts, one of the 2 or 3 richest men on the planet, that somehow Trump's going to say, oh, look, I intimidated Jeff Bezos, and that it's some kind of act of important courage for the Washington Post to have done what everybody expected them to do, what every major newspaper in the United States routinely does, ritualistically, which is endorse the Democratic president, is so deceitful, so self-glorifying. But even worse is this notion that somehow democracy is a casualty of a newspaper's decision to try and remain as neutral as possible, as though democracy depends upon American voters being guided by their superiors, by these newspaper editors and owners, to tell them how to vote. And without that, democracy can't possibly survive, because then people will be left on their own to make their own choices, which is very much how these people see their role in society. They just don't usually say it quite as explicitly, but they're so enraged at what's happening. And I think a part of this is this growing desperation in the face of not very encouraging polling data that continues to emerge, that's certainly not dispositive in the sense that it proves Kamala will lose and Trump will win, but certainly continues to undercut a lot of the optimism that Democrats had weeks and a couple of months ago, as we've gone over last night, which is why they're resorting to the desperation of Trump is Adolf Hitler. And a lot of this is based on this idea that Trump is Adolf Hitler, and it's the moral duty of every newspaper to stand in defense of American democracy by condemning Trump. Now, the other aspect that's just so delusional about this perspective is that they continue not to understand the extent to which Americans in large numbers hate these newspapers, distrust these newspapers, scorn these newspapers, believe that they deliberately lie in order to advance their own political agenda. Do you think there's huge numbers of undecided voters in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Arizona and Nevada and North Carolina and Georgia waiting on edge to have the Washington Post of all outlets tell them who to vote for? And that somehow this is some great loss because now the Washington Post, the people in this country don't get the benefit of hearing the Washington Post tell them how to think and how to behave, as if anybody cares what the Washington Post even thinks. But these people live in this completely self-contained world, totally self-delusional, where they feed themselves these glorifying narratives about the role of newspapers and their feisty and courageous defense of democracy, which means endorsing the Democratic Party candidate in every election, and the quote-unquote failure or refusal of the Washington Post, and as you'll see, the LA Times, to fulfill their role is something that they cannot contain. I mean, the amount of psychotic responses by very recognizable names is almost hard to express. Now, here from Semaphore, which is just another new digital outlet, the headline was, editor resigns, subscribers cancel, as Washington Post's non-endorsement prompts crisis at Jeff Bezos' paper. Quote, the first prominent journalist, editor-at-large Robert Kagan, resigned Friday in response to the decision, Semaphore first reported, but there may be more. Quote, people are shocked, furious, surprised, said an editorial board member, citing internal discussions around resignation. Quote, if you don't have the balls to own a newspaper, then don't. I mean, if this person is so offended at what the Washington Post did and accusing Jeff Bezos of lacking balls, what does it say about them that they're unwilling to object, to raise their voice in defense of democracy and against fascism and the new Adolf Hitler on the horizon, if they're not even willing to object under their own name, instead hiding behind anonymity? The article goes on, quote, members of the Post editorial board were taken aback on Friday when they learned about the decision from top opinion editor David Shipley. The board had drafted an endorsement of Harris earlier this month, which was sent to the paper's owner, Jeff Bezos. On Friday, NPR reported that an opinion staff learned the news at a tense meeting shortly before Lewis's announcement. One person familiar with the figures told Semaphore that the decision already seemed to be impacting subscriptions. In the last 24 hours, ending Friday afternoon, about 2,000 subscribers canceled their subscription, an unusually high number, an employee said. What does it say about people who subscribe to the Washington Post and then cancel the minute the Washington Post refuses to endorse Kamala Harris? Like, generally, the reason you're supposed to read a newspaper is to have access to the reporting, to understand what's going on in the world, not because you expect them to be an activist group on behalf of your ideology or political party, but of course that's exactly what the expectation now is of all of these papers who cater to a very specific political camp and an ideological faction, generally just affluent, highly educated people who live on the East and West Coast who support the Democratic Party almost entirely. That's the readers of the New York Times and the Washington Post, and they're not subscribing because they want to learn about the world. They're subscribing almost the way you donate to a group with a cause that you support. If you want to prioritize gun rights, you're going to give to the NRA. If you believe in abortion rights, you're going to give to Planned Parenthood. If you believe in the Democratic Party, you're going to give to the Washington Post and the New York Times. And the minute that either of them and any of them fail to advance your agenda, you're going to pull your money back because you're not actually reading them to learn anything. You don't really want them to do reporting. You want them to be activists on behalf of your candidate. And because the Washington Post, in this case, at least explicitly decided this year not to, you have all these liberal journalists demanding that everybody cancel their subscriptions. The article goes on, quote, another person who has seen the numbers downplayed them, saying the rate of cancellation Friday was, quote, not statistically significant, which is, I'm sure, what's going to happen. You're going to have a lot of media melodrama over this, but people don't follow and listen to what liberal pundits tell them to do. Here is the former Obama National Security Advisor and the current Biden White House official, Susan Rice. Here's how she reacted today upon this announcement that the Washington Post would not be endorsing, quote, so much for democracy dies in darkness. This is the most hypocritical chicken shit move from a publication that is supposed to hold people in power to account. Again, where would this idea come from that it's somehow courageous to endorse Kamala Harris and cowardly not to? And yes, newspapers are supposed to hold the powerful to account. Right now, the powerful are the people occupying the White House. That's Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And what they're angry about isn't the Washington Post's failure to hold Kamala Harris to account. They're angry at the Washington Post's refusal to cheerlead for Kamala Harris openly, explicitly in this election, because that is what their actual expectation of media outlets is, not to inform the world, not to do reporting, not to hold powerful people accountable, but to do everything possible to help the Democratic Party win and to defeat Trump. That really is what they believe is the overarching primary moral duty and function of the corporate media. A purely partisan activist entity as they see it. And because the Washington Post decided to keep a little bit of a pretense of being a neutral journalistic outlet, they're enraged because they don't think that's what journalism is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about helping the Democratic Party vanquish Donald Trump.